do think it's interesting, Gotti, in the Truth Social post where the president made this claim that his enemies are desperate to come to the table, he referred to the people on the other side of the table as the new Iranian regime. And I got to tell you, there really is no evidence that this is a new regime. You might remember he started this war urging the Iranian people to rise up, to take to the streets as they did in January, to overthrow their government. This is the same government that was in charge then, the same government that killed hundreds, potentially thousands of people back in January. And so for the president to claim that the regime has changed when it is literally the son of the old leader who is in charge now, when it is still officials who were born and bred inside of this system with its ideology of opposing the United States, of supporting proxy groups all around the region. It is really, really striking. And I think a lot of people here in the Middle East are asking, to what extent is the president just creating his own reality when he says that the Iranians want a ceasefire and that it is a new government and a new show in town over in Tehran? Gotti.
And Raf, as I understand it, the Iranian president, he released an open letter ahead of President Trump's address tonight, right? What was his message to Americans and to the world?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting document, Gotti. It's about 1,000 words long. It's in English. It's pretty clear that the Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian wanted the American people to hear something in English from Iran before they listened to this address from President Trump. The tone is fairly conciliatory. It says Iran holds no enmity towards the American people. And it says that the world is something of a crossroads, that it can choose between escalating conflict or between dialogue. Now, the tone there sort of hints at diplomacy. There is nothing explicit in this letter that says that Iran is prepared to go into ceasefire talks. And it is worth saying that the president in the Iranian system, in the Islamic Republic, is not a powerful figure. He is directly elected by the public, but the key decision maker, at least before this war, was always the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He, of course, was killed in the opening hours of the war. It remains much less clear now who is making decisions on the other side of the Persian Gulf here. But it certainly does not seem to be the President Masoud Pezeshkian, who is a relative moderate inside a regime of hardliners. It's worth saying, Gotti, when we are trying to assess the chances of diplomacy, there have been a lot of talk about American and Iranian officials meeting in Pakistan. So far, there are just no signs of that meeting, of those negotiations going to happen. Gotti.
Hopefully we'll get some more clarity tonight. Raf Sanchez, thank you so much. I want to bring in NBC News military analyst Colonel Steve Warren. Colonel, great to see you. From a military standpoint, I do want to ask, if the president comes forward and says, look, this is a victory, we won, it's over, is it a military victory in how you see it?
Well, that's a great question, Gotti. And you know, I guess if we define victory as accomplishing the military objectives that were initially laid out, I think you could say yes, it is a tactical military victory. Everything that the Central Command commander, everything that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs said they were attempting to do, they have generally done it. They've sunk the Iranian Navy. They have damaged the Iranian, almost completely wiped out the Iranians' ability to fire ballistic missiles. They have a few left, but significantly degraded. So they've accomplished those military objectives. Now, military objectives have to feed into a broader strategy. What's the strategic objective? I think, Gotti, it would be a lot harder to say that there's been a strategic victory tonight.
And Colonel, we have dozens of thousands of troops in the region right now. We've seen a lot of damage to infrastructure from our allies across the Middle East to a lot of our bases. If we were to pull out, logistically, what would that look like?
Yeah, pulling out. So remember, we normally have tens of thousands of troops stationed in that region all the time. The U.S. Central Command's forward headquarters is in Bahrain. One of the largest naval bases in the Navy is in Bahrain, is in the Middle East. So we have a lot of forces that are there sort of permanently. So assuming they were going to stay, then really what we're talking about doing is withdrawing the naval assets that are there, some of the additional aircraft that have been sent there in the past month, and of course the ground forces that were sent there in the last several weeks. So frankly, Gotti, not a difficult operation to withdraw to sort of status quo before the war began.
And Colonel, given everything that we've heard from the president throughout the past month, throughout the past day, what do you think we're going to hear in this primetime address tonight?
Well, that's something else, and Kristen Walker was so spot on in everything that she said earlier. You know, I think the president will probably let the country know sort of what he's already said. We've won, but we still want to win some more. I think that's my personal take, is that's probably where the tone is going to be. He's going to say that we've, achieved all of these objectives. We're close to the finish line, but we still have a little bit more work to do.
If he does say that, if that is his message, he says, we've won, but we're going to win some more, what does that do to our footprint there? Are we going to be seeing a withdrawal of troops, or is it going to be looking very much like it did yesterday and the day before and the day before?
I don't think we'll see a withdrawal of troops. I think it will look the same as yesterday. And, of course, the one wild card, Gotti, is whether or not we will put troops ashore in Iran. That's the last sort of thing that's out there that we don't really know what direction the president's going to go. He's got, enough force now, enough ground forces assembled that he could take an action on the ground. We don't know. I don't believe he would announce that ahead of time. So unless it's already happened, and he could. But he's got those forces there at his fingertips, and so that's the last thing that we have to wait and see if there's going to be some sort of a ground incursion into Iran.
And Colonel, we've got about 30 more seconds before this speech may start here, but I do want to ask, Strait of Hormuz, it does seem like there are ships transiting through there, right?
There are some going through now. There sure are, Gotti. And the president has I think he's sort of preheating the oven on that, where he's kind of said, hey, the Europeans, it's your oil, it's your problem kind of thing, right? So I have a feeling that the president is at least trying to downplay the importance to the United States of America of the Strait of Hormuz.
Colonel Steve Warren, really appreciate your insight, and we'll be checking back with you to see what the president says after this. That's going to do it for us tonight. Special coverage of the president's Oval Office address starts right now.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Tom Yamas.
And good evening. We are coming on the air tonight as we are moments away from a major presidential address. President Trump is about to speak to the nation from the White House. I'm here at Kennedy Space Center following that historic Artemis II launch. But let's turn to Washington, where the president is slated to give an update on the war in Iran now just over a month in. The president has said the war is ending soon within weeks, and said today that Iran's, quote, new regime leader asked for a ceasefire, which the president said he'd consider when the Strait of Hormuz is reopened. I want to bring in our senior Washington correspondent, Hallie Jackson. And Hallie, a lot to sort of decipher here. We still don't know exactly what the president is going to say, but some of the stuff he has put out on Truth Social, our sources, other Western leaders, people in the region have said is not necessarily true. There is not a new regime in charge of Iran right now.
Yeah, and it's a key moment for the president here tonight, too, Tom. Multiple sources tell our team he is expected to effectively declare success and touch on the timeline for an end to this war. He's previously suggested something like maybe 2 to 3 more weeks. But the president is addressing the nation about a war that is pretty unpopular, especially right now. Polling shows that a majority of Americans do not approve of this military action. It is a war that has spiked gas prices for Americans because of the closure of the key Strait of Hormuz, as you referenced, Tom. So a lot of questions here as the president has vacillated between escalating his threats and talking about the possibility of diplomacy.
And Hallie, the president has given us a hint of what he may say tonight, saying just yesterday inside the Oval Office, we see the president now. He's about to start speaking. Let's listen in.
Thank you very much. My fellow Americans, good evening. Let me begin by congratulating the team at NASA and our brave astronauts on the successful launch of Artemis II. It was quite something. It will be traveling further than any manned rocket has ever flown and will very substantially pass the moon, go around it, and come back home from a distance that has never been done before. It's amazing. They are on the way, and God bless them. These are brave people. We want to God bless those 4 unbelievable astronauts. As we speak this evening, it's been just 1 month since the United States military began Operation Epic Fury, targeting the world's #1 state sponsor of terror, Iran. In these past 4 weeks, our armed forces have delivered swift, decisive, overwhelming victories on the battlefield. Victories like few people have ever seen before. Tonight, Iran's Navy is gone. Their Air Force is in ruins. Their leaders, most of them terrorist regime they led, are now dead. Their command and control of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is being decimated as we speak. Their ability to launch missiles and drones is dramatically curtailed, and their weapons, factories, and rocket launchers are being blown to pieces. Very few of them left. Never in the history of warfare has an enemy suffered such clear and devastating large-scale losses in a matter of weeks. Our enemies are losing, in America, as it has been for 5 years under my presidency, is winning, and now winning bigger than ever before. Before discussing this current situation, I also want to thank our troops for the masterful job they did in taking the country of Venezuela in a matter of minutes. That hit was quick, lethal, violent, and respected by everyone all over the world. After rebuilding our military during my first term, we have by far the strongest military anywhere in the world. And now we're working along with Venezuela and are, in a true sense, joint venture partners. We're getting along incredibly well in the production and sale of massive amounts of oil and gas, the second largest reserves on Earth after the United States of America. We're now totally independent of the Middle East, and yet we are there to help. We don't have to be there. We don't need their oil. We don't need anything they have, but we're there to help our allies. Tonight, I want to provide an update on the tremendous progress our warriors have made in Iran and discuss why Operation Epic Fury is necessary for the safety of America and the security of the free world. From the very first day I announced my campaign for president in 2015, I have vowed that I would never allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. This fanatical regime has been chanting death to America, death to Israel for 47 years. Their proxies were behind the murder of 241 Americans in the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut, the slaughter of hundreds of our service members with roadside bombs. They were involved in the attack on the USS Cole, and they carried out the countless other heinous acts, including the just horrible, bloody atrocities of October 7th in Israel, something that most people have never seen anything like it. This murderous regime also recently killed 45,000 of their own people who were protesting in Iran. 45,000 dead. For these terrorists to have nuclear weapons would be an intolerable threat. The most violent and thuggish regime on earth would be free to carry out their campaigns of terror, coercion, conquest, and mass murder from behind a nuclear shield. I will never let that happen, and neither should any of our past presidents. This situation has been going on for 47 years and should have been handled long before I arrived in office. I did many things during my 2 terms in office to stop the quest for nuclear weapons by Iran first, and perhaps most importantly, I killed General Qasem Soleimani in my first term. He was an evil genius, brilliant person, a horrible human being, however, the father of the roadside bomb, and he lived. Just horrible what he did. Iran would have been perhaps in far better, stronger position. Had he lived, we would have had probably a different conversation tonight. But you know what? We'd still be winning and winning big. And then, very importantly, I terminated Barack Hussein Obama's Iran nuclear deal, a disaster. Obama gave them $1.7 billion in cash, green cash. Took it out of banks from Virginia, D.C., and Maryland, all the cash they had. He flew it by airplanes in an attempt to buy their respect and loyalty, but it didn't work. They laughed at our president and went on with their mission to have a nuclear bomb. His Iran deal would have led to a colossal arsenal of massive nuclear weapons for Iran, and they would have had them years ago, and they would have used them. It would have been a different world. There would have been no Middle East and no Israel right now, in my opinion, the opinion of a lot of great experts, had I not terminated that terrible deal. And I was so honored to do it. I was so proud to do it. It was so bad right from the beginning. Essentially, I did what no other president was willing to do. They made mistakes, and I am correcting them. My first preference was always the path of diplomacy, yet the regime continued their relentless quest for nuclear weapons and rejected every attempt at an agreement. For this reason, in June, I ordered a strike on Iran's key nuclear facilities, an Operation Midnight Hammer. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. Those beautiful B-2 bombers performed magnificently. We totally obliterated those nuclear sites. The regime then sought to rebuild their nuclear program at a totally different location, making clear they had no intention of abandoning their pursuit of nuclear weapons. They were also rapidly building a vast stockpile of conventional ballistic missiles and would soon have had missiles that could reach the American homeland, Europe, and virtually any other place on Earth. Iran's strategy was so obvious. They wanted to produce as many missiles as possible, and they did, with the longest range possible. And they had some weapons that nobody believed they had. We just learned that out. We took them out. We took them all out so that no one would really dare stop them. And their race for a nuclear bomb, a nuclear weapon like nobody's ever seen before. They were right at the doorstep. For years, everyone has said that Iran cannot have nuclear weapons, but in the end, those are just words if you're not willing to take action when the time comes. As I stated in my announcement of Operation Epic Fury, our objectives are very simple and clear. We are systematically dismantling the regime's ability to threaten America or project power outside of their borders. That means eliminating Iran's Navy, which is now absolutely destroyed, hurting their Air Force and their missile program at levels never seen before, and annihilating their defense industrial base. We've done all of it. Their Navy is gone. Their Air Force is gone. Their missiles are just about used up or beaten. Taken together, these actions will cripple Iran military, crush their ability to support terrorist proxies, and deny them the ability to build a nuclear bomb. Our armed forces have been extraordinary. There's never been anything like it militarily. Everyone is talking about it, and tonight I'm pleased to say that these core strategic objectives are nearing completion. As we celebrate this progress, we think especially of the 13 American warriors who have laid down their lives in this fight to prevent our children from ever having to face a nuclear Iran. Twice this past month, I have traveled to Dover Air Force Base, and it's been something. I wanted to be with those heroes as they return to American soil, and I was with them and their families, their parents, their wives, their husbands. We salute them, and now we must honor them by completing the mission for which they gave their lives. And every single one of the people, their loved ones said, "Please, sir, please finish the job." Every one of them. And we are going to finish the job, and we're going to finish it very fast. We're getting very close. I want to thank our allies in the Middle East, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain. They've been great, and we will not let them get hurt or fail in any way, shape, or form. Many Americans have been concerned to see the recent rise in gasoline prices here at home. This short-term increase has been entirely the result of the Iranian regime launching deranged terror attacks against commercial oil tankers in neighboring countries that have nothing to do with the conflict. This is yet more proof that Iran can never be trusted with nuclear weapons. They will use them, and they will use them quickly. It would lead to decades of extortion, economic pain, and instability worse than we can ever imagine. The United States has never been better prepared economically to confront this threat. You all know that. We built the strongest economy in history. We're going through it right now, the strongest in history. In 1 year, we've taken a dead and crippled country. I hate to say that, but we were a dead and crippled country after the last administration and made it the hottest country anywhere in the world by far, with no inflation, record-setting investments coming into the United States, over $18 trillion, and the highest stock market ever, with 53 all-time record highs in just 1 year. It all positioned us to get rid of a cancer that has long simmered. It's known as the nuclear Iran, and they didn't know what was coming. They've never imagined it. Remember, because of our drill baby drill program, America has plenty of gas. We have so much gas. Under my leadership, we are #1 producer of oil and gas on the planet, without even discussing the millions of barrels that we're getting from Venezuela. Because of the Trump administration's policies, we produce more oil and gas than Saudi Arabia and Russia combined. Think of that, Saudi Arabia and Russia combined. And that number will soon be substantially higher than that. There's no country like us anywhere in the world, and we're in great shape for the future. The United States imports almost no oil through the Hormuz Strait and won't be taking any in the future. We don't need it. We haven't needed it, and we don't need it. We've beaten and completely decimated Iran. They are decimated, both militarily and economically and in every other way. And the countries of the world that do receive oil through the Hormuz Strait must take care of that passage. They must cherish it. They must grab it and cherish it. They can do it easily. We will be helpful, but they should take the lead in protecting the oil that they so desperately depend on. So to those countries that can't get fuel, many of which refuse to get involved in the decapitation of Iran, we had to do it ourselves. I have a suggestion. #1, buy oil from the United States of America. We have plenty. We have so much. And #2, build up some delayed courage. Should have done it before. Should have done it with us, as we asked. Go to the Strait and just take it, protect it, use it for yourselves. Iran has been essentially decimated. The hard part is done, so it should be easy. And in any event, when this conflict is over, the Strait will open up naturally. It'll just open up naturally. They're going to want to be able to sell oil because that's all they have to try and rebuild. It will resume the flowing, and the gas prices will rapidly come back down. Stock prices will rapidly go back up. They haven't come down very much, frankly. They came down a little bit, but they've had some very good days over the last couple of days. We've done actually much better than I thought, but we had to take that little journey to Iran to get rid of this horrible threat. With our historic tax cuts, where people are just now talking about receiving larger refunds than they ever thought possible, they are getting so much more money than they thought. That's from the great, big, beautiful bill. Our economy is strong and improving by the day, and it will soon be roaring back like never before. It will top the levels that it was a month ago. I've made clear from the beginning of Operation Epic Fury that we will continue until our objectives are fully achieved. Thanks to the progress we've made, I can say tonight that we are on track to complete all of America's military objectives shortly, very shortly. We're going to hit them extremely hard over the next 2 to 3 weeks. We're going to bring them back to the Stone Ages where they belong. In the meantime, discussions are ongoing. Regime change was not our goal. We never said regime change, but regime change has occurred because of all of their original leaders' death. They're all dead. The new group is less radical and much more reasonable. Yet if during this period of time no deal is made, we have our eyes on key targets. If there is no deal, we are going to hit each and every one of their electric generating plants very hard and probably simultaneously. We have not hit their oil, even though that's the easiest target of all, because it would not give them even a small chance of survival or rebuilding. But we could hit it, and it would be gone, and there's not a thing they could do about it. They have no anti-aircraft equipment. Their radar is 100% annihilated. We are unstoppable as a military force. The nuclear sites that we obliterated with the B-2 bombers have been hit so hard that it would take months to get near the nuclear dust, and we have it under intense satellite surveillance and control. If we see them make a move, even a move for it, we'll hit them with missiles very hard again. We have all the cards, they have none. It's very important that we keep this conflict in perspective. American involvement in World War I lasted 1 year, 7 months, and 5 days. World War II lasted for 3 years, 8 months, and 25 days. The Korean War lasted for 3 years, 1 month, and 2 days. The Vietnam War lasted for 19 years, 5 months, and 29 days. Iraq went on for 8 years, 8 months, and 28 days. We are in this military operation, so powerful, so brilliant, against one of the most powerful countries for 32 days. And the country has been eviscerated and essentially is really no longer a threat. They were the bully of the Middle East, but they're the bully no longer. This is a true investment in your children and your grandchildren's future. The whole world is watching, and they can't leave the power, strength, and brilliance. They just can't believe what they're seeing. They leave it to your imagination, but they can't believe what they're seeing, the brilliance of the United States military. Tonight, every American can look forward to a day when we are finally free from the wickedness of Iranian aggression and the specter of nuclear blackmail. Because of the actions we have taken, we are on the cusp of ending Iran's sinister threat to America and the world. And I'll tell you, the world is watching. And when we do, when it's all over, the United States will be safer, stronger, more prosperous, and greater than it has ever been before. May God bless the men and women of the United States Armed Forces, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much, and good night.
You have been listening there to President Trump delivering that presidential address to the nation about the war against Iran. And you heard the president there lay out what we've heard from him to a large degree in the past as well. But on the timeline of the war, suggested that it may last 2 to 3 weeks longer. He again here threatened to obliterate Iran while also talking about the possibility for diplomacy moving forward and described the timeline here as wrapping up perhaps shortly. He, of course, addressed the 13 U.S. service members who were killed in this war as well. I want to bring in our White House correspondent, Monica Alba, who was watching all of this. The president, again, Monica, we have heard some of this in the past. The president has done these Q&As with full reporters in the Oval Office and elsewhere at the White House. He gives remarks where he speaks about the war fairly frequently. And that is what a lot of Americans heard in this primetime speech tonight.
Exactly, Hallie. This was meant to be, it seems, a broader recap to the American public of statements that the president and the White House and the Trump administration have really been making over the last couple of weeks. There wasn't any major, huge new announcement about the overall goals or objectives. There was an indication from the president about the timeline, which of course has been the subject of a lot of discussion, given the fact that even weeks ago when this did begin, the president was the one that was framing this as potentially being wrapped up very quickly, very soon, in the very near future. And at times he said that would be in a matter of weeks, maybe in a matter of days. And now tonight he is saying, according to his own military objectives that he set out at the beginning of this massive military operation, that it looks like that could be completed very shortly, in the next 2 or 3 weeks. But the president is trying to essentially portray to the American people that he believes almost enough has been achieved, not everything necessarily, because he said in the next couple of weeks that the U.S. is going to hit Iran potentially harder than they have been hit up until this point, with those thousands of targets that have already been attacked, and with the goals of the Iranian Navy essentially being annihilated, in addition to hitting their missile program. But the president also, Hallie, what struck me tonight, this was the first time that he gave a prime time address since the start of this conflict now almost 5 weeks ago. His first videos announcing this were posted on social media, and he has talked about this at almost every event that he has held in the last 30 plus days. This was almost a speech for people who hadn't necessarily been following that. And there may not be that many people, there may not be that many voters, there may not be that many Americans who were just tuning in for the first time, looking to see and get new information, which the president did not necessarily provide. He mentioned, Hallie, this idea that there is this dual track of the possibility for negotiations, which we know have been going on, at least through intermediaries in Pakistan. We know that, according to a source familiar with the discussions, Vice President Vance has been in touch with those intermediaries as recently as yesterday to deliver a message similar to the one that you just heard the president make, which is that they believe there is still the opportunity to make a deal with Tehran, to make a deal potentially here as some kind of an op-ramp that can happen, again, in parallel with the other military objectives that are still being pursued. But I do want to also just note, Hallie, that as we do sit here at the almost 5-week point, initially the timeline for this was estimated from the president, from the White House, to be about a 4 to 6 week timeline. And if he is saying that this is going to extend another 2 or 3 weeks, that could perhaps go beyond that initial time frame. Hallie.
Monica, I was just about to ask you about that, too, the timeline piece of it, because the president was consistent about that early on when this war began, 4 to 6 weeks, now 2 to 3, he's saying further, at a time when this war has not been popular with the majority of Americans. We have seen that reflected again and again in polling. We're going to talk more, too. And you heard the president address everything with the Strait of Hormuz. He is hoping that maybe allies can come help out on that front. He is suggesting a number of things related to the oil situation. Tankers basically paralyzed because they can't get through this key waterway. And here at home, gas prices have spiked. It's frustrating, I think, to some Americans, even with the majority of Republicans supporting this military action that the president has undertaken.
And he did acknowledge that particular pain point from Americans who have seen their gas tanks and the prices to fill them up really shoot up and skyrocket. And the administration has been trying to indicate that this is a short-term pain that people will be feeling, that eventually it will come back down. But as we did see them exceed $4 on average nationwide, that was a really interesting comment from the president. Again, trying to sort of justify this, saying he does believe that they're going to come down, but it's completely unclear when that might actually happen. And to your point about the Strait of Hormuz, and specifically allies that were not consulted in the lead up to announcing this major military operation in Iran, the president has for weeks sort of done this diplomatic dare, telling them he wants them at times to help with the Strait of Hormuz, specifically to ensure safe passage for vessels and for tankers. And then when they didn't essentially come to his aid, he said that he didn't need their help, that he didn't even want their help, and that he wasn't seeking it anymore. Now he is sort of framing this and making the argument that if the United States doesn't do anything about the Strait of Hormuz, that it won't be an issue for the United States, when it would be. And when we do know that other countries have certainly indicated that they do want to ensure that vessels and tankers can pass through there, but that this isn't their war, not our war, is the way that some of these foreign ministers and leaders have put it. But it is notable, Hallie, that just today the president said in an interview that he was absolutely considering withdrawing from NATO, from that incredibly important alliance, which we should point out is not something he could do unilaterally. He could not do that on his own. He would have to ask Congress potentially to do that. And right now there are absolutely no indications that something like that would pass. But the president did have some criticism for these countries that he does believe should step up and do more. But he didn't go as far as talking necessarily about the possibility of pulling the U.S. out of that treaty organization. Hallie.
Monica, thank you. Outside the West Wing there, I want to bring in Raf Sanchez, our correspondent who is in the region for us tonight. And Raf, you know, the president, Monica laid it out there, these two tracks. One, escalation potentially militarily, threatening to go after these critical Iranian sites. On the other hand, two, he's suggesting that there are talks, negotiations, a diplomatic track that is possible, even when Iranian officials haven't indicated the same thing. We saw that new letter from the Iranian president that seemed to strike a more conciliatory tone, but it is not at all clear that that's how the rest of the regime feels.
Yeah, that's absolutely an important distinction, Hallie. The Iranian president is not somebody who had a lot of power before the war. He really does have very little power today. So as you say, he put out this kind of interesting 1,000-word letter. It was addressed to the American people in English, and it was clear that he at least wanted the U.S. public to hear something from Iran in English before this address by President Trump. He said that Iran bears no enmity towards the United States. He said the world is at a crossroads between escalation and between engagement. Now, that would suggest that he at least is open to diplomacy, but he is not the one making the decisions on the other side of the Persian Gulf in Tehran. That is, as far as we can tell, some combination of senior officials inside the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, who is himself a former Guard commander, a hardliner, and the circle, at least, around the new Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Mujtaba Khamenei, who, of course, we have not heard from in the weeks since he was installed.
Right.
Hallie, I will tell you, the phrase that I think is going to be jumping out at U.S. allies here in the region from the president's address tonight is that the Strait of Hormuz, in his words, is going to open up naturally at the end of this war. That is just not the understanding of anyone here in the Gulf. And it is really just worth sketching out to viewers what the situation in the Strait was before the war and what it is now. Before the war, about 110 ships passing through every day. And it was in everyone's interest for those ships to go. Iranian oil was coming out, Iraqi oil, Saudi oil, Qatari gas, passing through a recognized passageway through the middle of the Strait of Hormuz. Today, something like 5 to 10 ships are passing through every day, and those ships are no longer going unmolested through the middle of the strait. They are being forced into Iranian waters between a series of islands. This has been nicknamed the Tehran toll booth. The Iranians are inspecting these ships as they come by. They are charging some of them $2 million to pass through. And every indication is that the Iranians want to make this into a long-term arrangement even after the war continues. And so the idea that the United States is going to step away and basically leave the Iranians in control of the Strait of Hormuz in the hope that they are just going to naturally give up this level of control that they have asserted, that is going to be very, very worrying for people here in the Middle East when they wake up in a couple of hours' time. Hallie.
And it also, Raf, I think speaks to the degree of potential political pressure that the president faces here at home, with gas prices now hitting that dubious milestone here in the U.S., national average above $4 a gallon. When you look at what's happening with the Strait of Hormuz, as we see some of the numbers there, Raf, and this idea that the president has suggested even today at a closed-door Easter event, the White House posted video, pulled it down, but he suggested he would be fine with staying. He has a desire for oil, for the region's oil, but he doesn't think that the American people have the patience to wait that out. I mean, it's a dynamic that is important for him domestically, but also, as you point out, internationally with allies too.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Monica said, the president has this habit of saying the United States doesn't use the Strait of Hormuz. It's much more important to countries in Europe, countries in Asia. The reality is oil is a global market. If there is a scarcity of oil anywhere in the world, it is going to affect the price that Americans pay at the pump. Another line that the president has been laying out is that the Iranians' ballistic missile and drone production capacity has been crippled, has been severely degraded. They are certainly not firing as many drones and missiles as they were at the beginning of the war, Hallie, but people here in the Gulf do not feel that they are facing a crippled Iran on the other side of the fairly narrow Persian Gulf waterway here. Just this morning, an Iranian cruise missile hit a Qatari oil tanker not very far from where we are. Yesterday, a Kuwaiti tanker in the port of was hit by a drone. In neither case were there any injuries, and thankfully no major environmental spill. But it's clear Iran retains the ability to threaten its neighbors, to threaten international shipping, and the idea that they have lost the ability to fire missiles, to fire drones, it just does not reflect reality, Hallie.
Our correspondent where but at the trade major economic impact, even with the oil market. You and I have talked about the futures, every week since this war began.
Yeah, and there are futures that trade, by the way, right now, more specifically in Asian markets are just straight up open right now. And then you see futures trading in the U.S. markets as well. Nothing particularly notable, but I do want to point out that commodities markets did move quite a lot. Brent oil, again, this is a measure of international oil prices, jumped during his remarks. It was about $98 going into his speech. It rose by $4 over the 20 minutes that he spoke. That is a noticeable move here, and it underscores everything that you were just talking about with Raf here, because if the idea is that the president is essentially giving the United States a potential off-ramp for actual activity in the Gulf, but then also leave it up to the Middle Eastern countries to essentially deal with Iran keeping that Strait of Hormuz effectively closed, well, then that doesn't do anything to relieve oil prices. So oil traders are not looking at his remarks and feeling optimistic about the idea that there will be a free flow of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz anytime in the near future. And for that reason, you do see oil prices continuing to rise. So to the degree that the president is acknowledging that gas prices at the pump are hurting consumers, his remarks tonight did not do the job of assuaging markets over getting those prices any lower from here. As Raf pointed out, these are globally priced markets, and based off of the movements that we're seeing in those globally priced markets, it doesn't seem like any of his remarks that he said just now are going to do anything to lower prices for Americans at the pump, Hallie.
Maybe worth making one other point, too, here, Brian, which is that even if this war does wind down, as the president seemed to suggest, maybe in the next 2 to 3 weeks, although, again, that's still somewhat of an open question, given what else he suggested about the timeline, staying less specific about it. It is not as though that as soon as the United States says this war is over, it means all things are a go in the Strait of Hormuz and gas prices drop back down right away. The White House has made that argument. Is that reality, or is that the hope?
Well, the White House has made that argument, and the president did say at one point during his speech that once all of this is over, gas prices will go down and stock markets will get back up to record highs. But I should point out that there was an interesting rhetorical point that he made where he was basically saying that on one hand, I mean, he acknowledged, and I think it's significant that he acknowledged there is a consumer pain. I think he said that Americans are concerned about rising gas prices. That is something we have not heard from the president so far. But then he also falsely claimed that there's no inflation in the United States. That's just simply not true. Government data confirms that prices in this country rose by 2.4% as of the last read on a yearly basis. That's prices across the board, up 2.4%. That is not zero inflation. And then he also said that higher prices were, quote, entirely the result of the Iranian regime. So, Hallie, that is 3 outs that he's giving himself and the White House to say if inflation does come down the pike as a result of these higher oil costs, because, again, it costs more money now just to move things around the country because of higher diesel costs, higher jet fuel costs as well. He's essentially going to say that was Iran's fault. He's going to say that, oh, by the way, we had no inflation to begin with, which is not true. And he's also saying, look, I get that you're talking about this, but again, we're going to deflect that over to the Iranians and say that that's their fault. Again, will that be a convincing argument for them, especially as they go to the midterms? That is an open question.
Brian Chung, thank you very much for that. Obviously, much more to follow as we are tracking all things related to the war against Iran right here on NBC News Now. We are also tracking that other big news of the evening. You heard the president briefly address it. That is, of course, that historic mission around the moon, Artemis 2. We're going to have continuing coverage on what is happening way up in space with our Gadi Schwartz right after this very quick break. Stay with us.
This is a moment when people are profoundly